So I'm going to have us transition over to Iran and start looking at some of the different aspects of the political culture, the social challenges, and questions about Iran, um, as well as maybe some quick structures of government. As I mentioned to Len and Benicio, who are here with me right now. This PowerPoint is very, very long. I am going to edit it for uh, so that you have the ability to kind of go through things more efficiently. But as I've said before, I really strongly suggest that you read the 5 Steps to a 5 Review chapter on Iran before jumping into this recording and the checking out the PowerPoint. Let me go ahead first and get this as a full screen. If I can find my full screen. Gosh, folks, I tell you, I haven't had, there we go. Like slideshow, where is the button? Haven't had enough coffee. All right, and then I'm going to screen share so that you can see this. All right, so the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, because it is a theocracy, is going to be unlike any of the other AP6 in terms of government structures. It's going to be unique. The plus side with that uniqueness, however, well, I shouldn't say it's unlike any others. It's unlike Great Britain, Russia, Mexico, and Nigeria. The plus side to this uniqueness is that it is possible, and I think helpful, to think about religion and the way religion you'll see it pervade Iran, as similarly to the powers and influence of the Chinese Communist Party in China, and how we have some different government structures and the parallel structure, for example, of that vertical and horizontal hierarchy of relationship between government and party. I think that it is helpful to think about Iran similarly, but this is focused on religious ideology instead of political ideology. Okay, I'm gonna zip through a lot of these, like I said, but the important thing here to keep in mind, this is about Iranian political culture, is the Ayatollah Khomeini, who's the original, for original, Ayatollah or supreme leader of Iran, kind of lays out the importance of religion and Shia Islam for Iran in this statement, where Islamic government, Islamic politics, Islamic society, the Islamic economy is about politics and religion melding. Anyone who will say that religion is separate from politics is a fool. He does not know Islam or politics. Iran is the world's only theocratic republic. Notice the term republic here. That means there are elections where people are elected through a national vote. The free and fair part of this national vote and the local votes can be called into question at times, and it has been by people in Iran. But that is why it's a republic. There are representatives taking action and making decisions on behalf of everybody else, theocratic, because it has the fusion of religion into politics. Okay. It is a good example of tradition versus modernization. So it's an excellent comparison. That would be a contrast when it comes to, once again, China. Okay, Mao and Mao's approaches being very traditionalist versus kind of this modernizing influence, traditionalist in terms of communism, versus the modernization of Xi Jinping and his socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Iran, it's possible to look at Iran as kind of the opposite, where the tension between tradition and modernization tends to consistently go back to tradition. Really basic geography. Iran immediately next to the areas that we've talked about at the very start of the year, Afghanistan, and in between what is referred to as the Middle East, and increasingly moving in the direction of India here in the east. Okay, lots of mountains, which is important in terms of the products and the demographics of Iran, with the capital up in the north, very close to, again, to the mountains. This just gives you a breakdown of all the kind of details about the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'll add in the Democracy Now! Or the Geography Now! Video that does an overview of Iran that's really, really solid. So I'm not going to jump into this too much, other than this right here, that is the second largest oil producer in the Middle East and the fourth largest in the world. That is significant, folks, when it comes to, once again, Iran being a rentier state with a great deal of patron clientelism between government and religious leaders when it comes to oil production. It's also significant because Iran has experienced these heavy sanctions from the United States and Western Europe, which means this oil that's being produced can't be bought in Western countries, and then either is exported in trade relationships to parts of Africa, sometimes even to Russia or to China. The urbanization of Iran, just want to draw your attention to the fact that it's, in terms of urbanization, it's a little bit lower than what we would have seen in Mexico, for example, and that there's a large portion of the population that still lives in rural areas. This is again the breakdown of the demographics, both religious and ethnic. You do have 95% of the population identifies as Shia. However, there are people in Iran who have other forms of religious observance, people who identify as Baha'i. This will come up in the cleavages section, also Christian and Jewish. Those religions are not officially sanctioned by the government, which means that being a practicing Jew in Iran is very, very, very difficult. The government actually doesn't even allow synagogues to be built. Only existing synagogues can continue to function without government intervention in some way, and sometimes even synagogues can't be repaired. So the government does not support these other forms of religious observance, and people who identify as Baha'i, which is spelled BAHA', are frequently persecuted directly by the government of Iran. And you can look at this as a comparison similarly to the experience of Muslim people in Chechnya in Russia, or Muslim people in Xinjiang province in China, as an ethnic and religious minority where people are directly experiencing the use of force to suppress religious observance and to limit the ability of these religions to influence the creation of a nation state. Also Northern Ireland, with the influence of Irish Catholicism. Okay, big, huge, super important thing with Iran. If you look at this population pyramid, notice that the average age as of 2019 is approximately 31 years old. Folks, Iran is an incredibly young country. That is similar to Nigeria. Nigeria is an incredibly young country. Not young in terms of how long the country's existed, per se, but how old people are. If you look at this population pyramid, it's the exact opposite situation of China or Great Britain. We have an incredibly large number of young people in this bubble of births that happened approximately 31, 32 years ago. Okay. The issue that's kind of led to this, all right, just as in China, there was the one-child policy, which impacted births and also the ratio of men to women in China. In Iran, this is roughly attached to public policy as well by the government. Revolution in 1979, the government encouraged people to have children because there was a war with Iraq, but then encouraged birth control. There is even like I put here, a state-owned condom factory. So, we have public policy that many people assume religion and restrictions being placed on, say, women's access to contraception. That's not the case in Iran consistently. The gendering of having large families, definitely traditionalist, but birth control, access to condoms, that's something that is different and unique. That's kind of, I think, important to pay attention to. Yes, mostly the older generation. However, we've got this big bubble, which is important when we talk about the leadership of Iran, because the political leadership of Iran is not only exclusively male, it is much older. People are older, 50 years of age or older. And if you look at the population pyramid, that means you have a fairly small portion of the population leading the country in comparison to all these young people. So just to think about, this could come up mostly as a multiple choice question. Future problems, the challenge of activism, the desire for perhaps greater westernization among young people. When you have a government that limits and censors information from the West, or makes dancing, for example, illegal, or limits people's ability to sing or have access to particular kinds of music, or alcohol, and drinking alcohol is forbidden. When you have a large portion of young people having those kinds of guidelines and laws that are used to enforce them, because there actually is a religious police in Iran, that's a really big challenge the government's going to have to address. Do we reform these guidelines and religious-based laws, or do we keep things more traditionalist? I'm just going to check out. Yeah, so Benicio, your question in terms of a possible future, a future problem, yes. And this is in 30, or this is like 50 years from now, but solving the issue of high demand for Social Security or pensions or additional government assistance. In other words, Iran would have to continue to maintain a growing population, which is hard when you have an economy that's experiencing sanctions, if it's going to address the needs of this eventually older population. That's an excellent point to bring up as well. Okay, I've run you through the difference between Sunni and Shia. I really don't, this is not going to show up on the exam per se, but it is just important for you to keep in mind in terms of why people who live in Iran as Shia are isolated when it comes to religion from much of the rest of the Muslim world, with over a billion observant Muslims, because of the differences of Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. Okay, Iranian history. All of this, not likely to see coming up on the exam, okay? With basically information, folks, that goes back to what you would have learned in Global 1 and 2 in some ways, possibly 3, 4. What's significant here is the Pahlavi dynasty, in that the leader of Iran, who's going to be referred to as the Shah, heavily westernizes the country, works very closely with the United States, has a secularized legal system that replaces Sharia law, is viewed as a puppet. Also, like lots of rights, basically heavily westernizing women's rights in Iran that traditionalist, religiously observant Muslims were very concerned about, resistant to, which is one of the reasons that we have the Islamic Revolution in 1979. There is an organization called SAVAK that was basically like a state-run secret police where dissidents, people who questioned his regime, were tortured and sometimes killed in Iran and abroad. These would typically be people who were either communist or also supporters of the Ayatollah Khomeini, which, again, once the pressures build against the Shah, leads to the revolution. Running further forward, I put this discussion question up here. Can we have a country that is a rentier state actually be legitimate? That's goes to the question of legitimacy and the fact that we have religion as a source of legitimacy, and kind of look at this as a trigger for the complete regime change and revolution in 1979. I'm kind of, again, popping through this because this has lots of information that I think is important, but then not right now what we need to focus on. What is important to focus on is the theocratic underpinnings, the theocratic ideas that end up in government in Iran. So the concept, we're going to talk rule of law, okay? Iran has religious law. It also does have civil codes, but it has religious law. Does not have the same approach to rule of law that any of the AP6 countries have. The term, and this is a term that could very much come up as a multiple choice question, is jurist's guardianship. All right. And the concept of jurist guardianship is that senior clergy, so senior religious leaders, men, have authority over the entire community in which they are religious leaders, not just people who might be women or underage, but that the protection, the religious protection and guidance offered by the clergy applies to an entire community and laws as well. Okay. So jurist guardianship, or velayat faqih, super important as a concept in terms of the founding principles of Iran. I'm going through these again. The significant shift between Westernization and then more visibly observant forms of Islam for women in particular, significant when it comes to women's rights in Iran, despite, once again, having that kind of unusual, we might look at it as unusual access to birth control that was a policy made by the state. Okay. Current leader of Iran is the Ayatollah Khomeini from 1989 until now. So the reason I mentioned this for those of you who are in class when I did it. Khomeini, the original leader, Khamenei, the person who comes after him. He does become leader because there were constitutional changes made. He doesn't have the same background or credentials as the Ayatollah, but he is the current supreme leader and the chief jurist who's supposed to have guardianship over the entire state. Going to go through the presidents. Well, actually, I'll do this. So, knowing the names of Rafsanjani or President Khatami, I don't think is as helpful as it is to know that in Iran, and this is definitely on the exam, Iran is not viewed as really having formal political parties, in that political groupings for elections are not lasting. They don't persist necessarily through election cycles, and instead it is a constant tension between reformers and moderates versus tradition and people who are more conservative leading the government. Again, this government is dominated by men. The parallel here that I think might be helpful for you to consider is, once again, China and traditionalists under Mao versus reformers like Deng Xiaoping, or traditionalists who might have resisted Xi Jinping becoming president more or less indefinitely versus reformers who share his vision of the China dream and socialism under Chinese characteristics. That's why I think like one helpful parallel that might be a way to compare the state of Iran to China. Okay, so we have moderates. We have people who are even more liberal, like President Khatami. Okay, and when he was elected, women, university students, young adults, that bubble that we saw of young people in Iran supported someone who was viewed as more liberal. And this is liberal in the more traditional Western sense, okay? Not liberal in the Western European sense, like with the UK. Liberal in terms of like a reformer, someone who's looking to change and open up Iran. There's going to be a backlash toward this that will happen in 2006. This is largely, you can look at this as a reaction in part to the US's engagement in Iraq, in heavily militarized engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan, right next door to Iran, and that conservatives and traditionalists who viewed the United States and Western Europe very, very negatively felt that we needed a shift in power. So conservative traditionalists come back into power in the early 2000s again after 2006. Okay, we'll talk more about the Guardian Council, but again, the Guardian Council is a religious centered organization or institution within the Iranian government that does have direct political power to veto laws or to nullify and get rid of particular guidelines or statutes, okay? Even so far as with the Guardian Council, disqualifying candidates for election, which they can do. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is going to be elected, even though he is secular, he's not a cleric, he is an ultra-conservative. He is someone who holds the office for 2 terms and does a great deal to suppress many of the liberal reforms that had been coming about from the 90s to the early 2000s, and ramps up Iran's nuclear weapon development program. 2009, So the president in 2009, who was running against Ahmadinejad, Mousavi, or the candidate rather, not the president, the candidate running against Ahmadinejad, Mousavi. There's an enormous turnout. The results of the election were highly questionable, to the point where results were being announced of Ahmadinejad's re-election they were being announced before, or as people were still voting. Okay, there were huge protests that took place. This is referred to as the Green Movement. Important when it comes to the exam, and an example of not only a popular resistance movement, and you can compare this to Tlatelolco Square in 1968 in Mexico. You could look at this as separatism, or compare it to activism like in the Zapatistas in Chiapas, or protests in Northern Ireland that led to eventual conflict. Here, the cleavage is largely age, and based on accusations of corruption and manipulation of the election. So we'll talk about, or just to quickly talk about some of the actions that were taken by Ahmadinejad. Again, rejection by this institution, the Council of Guardians, of reform-minded candidates. The restriction of civil liberties. There is the morality police is going to become more active. This is actually an image of morality police questioning a woman in Iran. There was an increase of arrests, tortures, disappearances by the Nationalized Secret Police Force. They are the Besiege. I'll give you the actual term here in a moment, or later in the slide deck, or it's also in your reading from the review book. And basically a shift away from all the changes that have been kind of brought into place prior to Ahmadinejad being in office. Okay, so this is again about legitimacy. Remember, we have a country that is very much connected to religion in terms of legitimacy. Okay, the person who succeeds Ahmadinejad is President Rouhani. President Rouhani is viewed as a moderate, but he is a cleric, so he is a religious leader. So what this is kind of a return to religious legitimacy in a theocratic state, while at the same time balancing, so I have the concept of a safety valve, balancing the pushback that might take place from young people or people who are more moderate to some of the hardline policies of Ahmadinejad that existed prior to 2013. Okay, political institutions. Here's where it becomes very different than any of the other countries that we talked about, with the exception of China and the one-party state. What I want to point out, first of all, okay, is that we have a parliament. This is the Majlis, all right, where the 290 members of the Majlis are directly elected every 4 years and pass legislation. Okay, some members of the Majlis may be religiously observant or even religious leaders, but secular Muslims, so people who are not outwardly religiously observant in terms of like a cleric, are able to be elected as well if approved by the Guardian Council. All right. The Assembly of Experts, okay, is also elected every 8 years. Again, the Guardian Council, so I have the arrow. The Guardian Council must approve of anyone who is going to be on the Assembly of Experts. And this institution is responsible for monitoring the existing supreme leader, the Ayatollah, and choosing the next supreme leader. So you do not want to refer to Iran as having a bicameral legislature, because the Assembly of Experts are not a legislative branch. But you can look at them as a source of a check on the power of the supreme leader, and to some degree a very strong example of religion overlapping with secular leadership from the Majlis. Again, want to draw attention to the arrows. Okay, this Guardian Council vets candidates for the Assembly of Experts. This Guardian Council vets candidates for the Majlis. Okay, so that's lots and lots and lots of power. The Majlis has to communicate with the supreme leader, and is expected really to support the supreme leader, where the president is directly elected. We don't have a prime minister. We have a presidential system with a parliament. Okay, so this is where you might be able to you don't want to describe Iran as being semi-presidential, because we don't have a prime minister with the same, we just don't have a semi-presidential system. We've got a parliamentary structure with the presidential system with a cabinet and everything like that. But to go back to the Guardian Council, okay, notice again the lines of power. The supreme leader appoints the head of the judicial branch, the head of the judiciary, who then appoints 6 members of the 12 in the Guardian Council. Okay, the remaining 12 people in the Guardian Council come from selection and approval within the Majlis. Okay, but I also want to point out the Guardian Council approves of candidates for the Majlis. That means people in the Majlis who are elected directly by the people really also owe their position in the Majlis to the Guardian Council. So people on the Guardian Council tend to reflect frequently, if moving in a more conservative direction, the conservative ideas of those who are already in the Majlis, because they were approved by the Guardian Council. All right, so supreme leader appoints the head of judiciary. The head of the judiciary appoints the Guardian Council, 6 people. The Majlis, where people are elected every 4 years, selects 12 members for the Guardian Council. Okay, the Guardian Council then approves of people who run in direct election from the people for the Assembly of Experts. All right. The supreme leader, however, is involved in all of this, is overseeing all of it as the religious and political leader, because we have a theocracy in Iran. The supreme leader appoints the Expediency Council. Notice it says dispute management. Okay, the Expediency Council exists because the Guardian Council, with all of its appointment power, also has veto power over actions of the Majlis. So there's lots of conflict that can happen between the Majlis and the Guardian Council. The Expediency Council, think of expediency as getting things done quickly, all right, is appointed by the supreme leader to manage disputes between the Guardian Council and the Majlis, all right, to resolve issues. This is, again, all done through the lens of religion, because all of the individuals on the Expediency Council all of the individuals in the Guardian Council are also clerics. Okay, we have again a theocratic system, and currently with President Rouhani, a religious leader as president, with a large number of religious leaders in parliament as well. Okay, this is just give you the whole overview. Okay, unitary, again, semi-presidential might be an effective way to describe this. Like I said, it's inexact, folks. It's not semi-presidential in the way that Russia is. So just be careful in terms of describing that, the semi-presidential. Even though I'm resistant right now to describe it as semi-presidential, it might pop up on the exam as semi-presidential, maybe. What's significant here, supreme leader is the head of state, the Ayatollah is the head of state, the head of government is the president, okay? Just as a parallel, the Queen is the head of state in the UK, the Prime Minister is the head of government. All right. This is just a quick overview of the Supreme Leader and some of the powers the Supreme Leader has, or that the trustee of the community, supervising politics and enforcing laws that conform to Islam. This is velayat efeki, this is juris guardianship. So his lifetime appointment is to literally be the chief judge and religious leader for all actions that take place in Iran. Powers that the Ayatollah has. This is significant, folks. The Ayatollah, as head of state, has far more powers than the Queen of England, okay? Not just the Guardian Council, but the Ayatollah himself can limit presidential candidates. The Ayatollah can dismiss or overrule the president. The Ayatollah leads the armed forces, declares peace, issues decrees for national referenda. It appoints the chief jurist, appoints half the members of the Guardian Council, and leads Friday, sets or chooses leaders for Friday prayer, which is very significant and for observant Muslims, as well as whoever leads the Ministry of Information with the radio and TV. Folks, this is lots and lots of power, which makes Iran's approach to governance, with him as the head of state, unique. Something that would be an excellent example to compare with, say, a president like the president of Mexico, who's not involved in many of these things. That we've got checks and balances when it comes to dismissing a president. That if there's going to be a national referenda in Mexico, which the president can call, is going to need some support from the legislative branch in order to do it. There are specific qualifications for the Ayatollah. I don't see where you would need to know these qualifications in terms of exams, but the idea here is that these qualifications are religious in nature, and because we're not having a position where someone is elected, so it's not about expertise in terms of politics, it's about expertise in religion and how religion relates to politics. Okay, Assembly of Religious Experts, which, if you remember, again, to go back to it, Assembly of Religious Experts, who actually monitors the who's going to become the next Supreme Leader, is also involved with choosing the Supreme Leader. The Assembly of Religious Experts, single-member district plurality, okay? This is the same for the Majlis, it's single-member district plurality voting. Guardian Council must approve them. There's actually a religious exam that you have to pass in order to be on the Assembly of Religious Experts. Okay, they are the check on the power of the Ayatollah, and this was instituted after the Ayatollah Khomeini's, the first Ayatollah's death, with the constitutional changes that were brought about to have the Ayatollah Khomeini succeed him. Largely a rubber stamp organization. Note they only meet twice, 2 days, twice a year, so a total of 4 days a year. Okay, they're basically there to approve of the actions that the Ayatollah makes. Okay, again, think of this maybe as a helpful parallel. These individuals have a similar power to, say, the Politburo in China, where the Politburo is going to basically approve of any actions that the leader Xi Jinping makes as leader of China. Key difference, they're not elected, okay? But an organization that's supposed to kind of act as a possible check on Xi Jinping's power. But the Politburo doesn't have the ability to remove Xi Jinping, whereas the Assembly of Religious Experts in theory could, or actually approve who's going to be the next Ayatollah. The Guardian Council, again, I'm going to go back to the slide. Okay, the Guardian Council, and when it comes to exam, you really want to know what the Guardian Council is because they have so much power in Iran. All right, the Guardian Council, all male, 12 members, 6-year terms, 6 appointed by the Supreme Leader, 6 lay members. That means people who are not necessarily, that are secular or not necessarily also clerics, but they have to be approved by the head of Judiciary. They have to be approved by the Majlis to also be on the Guardian Council. They look at constitutionality. They look at who can run for elections. And we say constitutionality, folks, we mean alignment with the Constitution of Iran when it comes to religious law, okay? They have power to veto anything coming through the Majlis. You can describe this as an upper house of parliament, but be very careful with that because we have all of these additional religious powers, okay? This would be an excellent opportunity to use Iran, say, on a short answer question as a counterexample to the structures of a bicameral legislature where we have a unicameral legislature where we do have a check, but it's a very extreme check on the power of the parliament or the Majlis, and that's different from the other countries that we might talk about that have co-equal branches like Mexico or Nigeria. The Expediency Council, like I mentioned again, Expediency Council up here, appointed by the Supreme Leader. They're involved in dispute management. Expediency Council, 39 members, directly appointed by the Supreme Leader. The Expediency Council does also include the President, the Chief Judge, Speaker of the Majlis, so people who are in the other parts of the government and religious leadership of Iran. But they are there to kind of balance things out when it comes to possible conflicts. But they can also, this is a special power that they have, originate their own legislation. Okay, so I have the question, like, why might this be a concern? Well, this might be a concern, folks, because you have individuals who are appointed by the Supreme Leader, not elected from the people, who can actually start legislation that impacts the entire population of Iran. That's pretty significant as a power, especially in a country we have large numbers of young people who might not support traditionalist views and religious conservatism to the same degree that those in power do. They're also, if you look at kind of just the demographics here, not only all male, but also older in comparison to the rest of the population of Iran. Running through the current head of government, knowing all the fine details of the current head of government aren't as important as it is to know 2 terms. He is term limited, just like Mexico is term limited, just like Nigeria is term limited. You might get a question like we went through in class, the question of term limits being a good or a bad thing. Okay, We can view this as a positive to have term limits on the presidency, because the president, as head of government, and who's directly elected by the people, is actually an opportunity to reflect whether or not the country is more reform-minded or more conservative focused. Okay, there's this might come out in terms of the election system. The election system does have a 2-round process unless there's a outright majority in the first time vote. That is like Russia, that has a 2-round process for president. Although Russia, remember, is multi-party in its system, its electoral system has this 2-round process for president if no one gets a majority. And we look at this again as kind of attempting to possibly reflect the will of the people as a whole. All right. Mexico does not have a 2-round process because we only need a plurality. Although Nigeria will also have a 2-round process that we'll cover when we talk about Nigeria. All right. Presidential powers and qualifications. Okay. Many of these powers, folks, exactly the same powers of the other presidents that we've talked about. Things like presenting legislation to parliaments, selecting cabinet members, signing and approving treaties and agreements, the head of the National Security Council. This is all very similar things to powers that, say, Vladimir Putin has as president, that the president of Mexico has. The thing that I would point out, hey, this is important, he's not commander-in-chief. That is the Ayatollah. That's the difference in the presidency with Iran. Okay. Actually, Len, I missed your question earlier. So, and I apologize. So your question that you asked with the 6 lawyers, are you asking, so your question was for the 6 lawyers, are they mostly in charge of Sharia law? You're asking about the Guardian Council, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the thing to keep in mind with Iran, because we have a theocracy, all of these, I'm going to go again back to the chart, the Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Council, the head of the Judiciary, and the Guardian Council are all they are all lawyers, okay, and they are all religious experts. All right, so the 6 approved members, approved by the Majlis, who sit on the Guardian Council, are lawyers. That means they also have to be experts in Sharia law, in addition to regular civil law, like they would in another country. So and again, they might be secular. They might also themselves be religious leaders. That's a kind of a side issue. But what's important here is that all of these organizations, or I'm sorry, all of these institutions rather, within the government, the Expediency Council, again, the Assembly of Experts, the Guardian Council, the head of the Judiciary, are infused with and focused on interpretations of Sharia law. Okay, so there's not any one group who's in charge of Sharia law. This is the very meaning of jurist guardianship. All of them should act as guardians of Islamic law. All of them have the responsibility to look out for the interests of the Iranian people as a whole when it comes to interpretation of Sharia law, with the ultimate kind of guide and decider of all this being the supreme leader or Ayatollah. Does that help with addressing your question?
Yeah, very much.
Okay. Back to the presidential powers. One thing that I would say, this is a big power right here. Important when we're going to talk about a rentier state, right? So one of the powers that the president has is to actually lead the economic development of Iran. We have a country that is very heavily focused on oil as a source of its revenue, all right? rent-seeking behavior, right, when the president can appoint governors, mayors, ambassadors. This is an opportunity for patronage and patron clientelism. All right. That president has a lot of clout, a lot of influence. And again, with the president being also the head of the economy, these governors can also be placed in positions of power and influence that allow them to gain access to financial wealth and possibly engage in corrupt actions that give them access to the profit from oil, from the nationalized oil industry in Iran. Okay. Also, all right, we're going to talk about checks on the president. All right, this is unique to Iran. Yes, we have the impeachment process in the federal systems of Nigeria and Mexico. Russia does have an impeachment process, but we're not going to see that ever engaged with Vladimir Putin, and I would stick to impeachment process, talking about impeachment for exam purposes only with Mexico and Nigeria. We have the check on the prime minister with the vote of no confidence. In Iran, this is a massive check on the actions of the president, because the actions of a president can be overruled, or even he can be removed from power directly by the supreme leader. That means when the president might be using patron clientelism and patronage to make these appointments, the supreme leader is checking out what he's doing as well. Okay. Treaties and laws. When the president of Iran signed the nuclear deal with the United States, it actually meant that the supreme leader had approved of that nuclear deal from the background. Okay. Folks, that was a really big deal. This is not exam focused, but it is focused on international politics and the role of the United States. That's significant for the long-term relationship of the United States and Iran, because when President Trump removed the United States from that agreement with Iran, the president was essentially also turning away from the supreme leader's actions and really taking what is a big risk when the supreme leader prior to that was not pro-US, and from the background approving of that legislation or that treaty rather to limit nuclear development. So that is one of the reasons why currently President Biden and our State Department has been so active in reaching out to Iran, because of the concern of this rupture between the supreme leader and the nuclear deal that was made, and kind of the resurgence of people who are more traditionalist and anti-US. Okay, vice president, all right. Vice presidents are appointed by the president, again, possible source of corruption and patronage. You only have succession if there's approval by the supreme leader, but then we're going to have elections to replace him. They have a lot of power, a lot of influence. Ding, 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 importance. We can have women. So these vice presidents can act as a cabinet in many ways. Okay. They can be women. Okay. So the president of Iran can appoint women with particular areas of expertise to be on his cabinet. President, just like in other countries, as head of government, also heads the bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy is dominated by the clergy. The key things to keep in mind with the ministries in the bureaucracy is the first one is the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance that is focused on media control and censorship, as well as proper conduct, which means the religious police, basically, in Iran, and monitoring the public's actions. The heavy industries of Iran are heavily tied, so oil production and metals, mining, steel production, all managed by the government through nationalized factories. So this is corporatist, folks, in terms of an approach. All right, that's significant. Again, we want to return to the idea of Iran being a rentier state when it comes to the process of patronage, the connection with oil, and power and influence. Majlis, the one thing that I'll kind of point out as a kind of wrinkle here that's unique with the Majlis, even though the country is majority Shia and is a theocracy that focuses on Shia Islam, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians do have guaranteed seats in the Majlis. So we can look at this as, if it would come up on the exam, an example of attempting to lessen religious cleavages. So, parallels. In the UK, we have the cleavage of religion between Northern Ireland, the Northern Irish people who are Catholic, and Northern Irish people who are Protestant, and the UK actually still being in control of Northern Ireland, right? So the solution to that increased nationalism of people who are Northern Irish, or the increased nationalism of people who are Scottish, was devolution. Here, we have an attempt to address the issue of a religious cleavage through inclusion in the Majlis. But if you think about it, 5 seats, okay, out of 290, these 5 individuals do not have, they don't have the ability to influence legislation very much at all. But we at least have constitutionally some inclusiveness. People who identify as Baha'i, because the religion, people who identify as Baha'i, they are not recognized by the state. Christians are approved, Jews are approved by the state, Zoroastrians are approved by the state, because they have to be approved by the state because Iran is a theocracy. People who are Baha'i, which are not approved by the state, frequently religiously persecuted by the government, cannot have any positions or have seats in the Majlis. Okay, important. One, again, be careful with the assumptions about very orthodox or traditionalist religious observance. There are women who are in the Majlis, so the Guardian Council did approve women to run for positions in the Iranian parliament. Okay, and they are not a rubber stamp institution. They don't say simply yes to everything that the Guardian Council or the Ayatollah may want, or that even the president may want. They do act as a check on power. Also, notice the way that this is set up in the chart of alliances, people who are principalists and reformists. This is why I mentioned that we don't have political parties in Iran. You have groups of people who organize together to be principalists. So principalists meaning the principal interpreters of Sharia law, or the traditionalists, versus reformists. Okay, we have factionalism, kind of like factionalism in China within the Chinese Communist Party, but we do not have political parties. What's significant in the last election is notice that reformists lost many seats and principalists gain seats. people have attributed this, specifically foreign policy experts, to a degree, the United States changing its stance on the nuclear arms agreement. Okay, powers and qualifications of people in the Majlis. All right, you have to be. So we have some limits on people who serve in the Majlis. They have to submit their names to the Guardian Council in order to be approved to run, and that's going to happen every election cycle. So you might lose the approval of the Guardian Council if you're viewed as someone who's not aligning with the Guardian Council's views on what should be happening with government policy, and how it might be reflecting or not reflecting Sharia law. Okay. People who are running for the first time have to have, the required credentials and a university degree. Again, if you go to university in Iran, that means you're also going to receive religious training. Powers, and this is to help you contrast the parliamentary powers that the Majlis has, say the parliamentary powers of the lower house in the UK, the House of Commons, or the lower house in in Russia, the Duma. Okay, they can enact laws like any other parliament with approval of the Guardian Council. They can choose people to be on the Guardian Council, but the list has to be approved by the chief judge, who is then appointed by the Ayatollah. They can investigate cabinet members and have public complaints against the executive and judiciary. So here we're getting some separation of powers between the executive, okay, between the president and the Majlis. They can remove cabinet members, but not the president. So if the president has gone too far in appointing some of his favorites, then the Majlis can push back. Even though the president is in charge of the budget, the Majlis has to approve the budget. The Majlis also has to approve cabinet appointments. The Majlis also has to approve of treaties and loans, which is why when the nuclear deal changed and the US's official stance from the executive branch changed on the nuclear deal, and large parts of the Congress, specifically there were some Democrats, but primarily Republicans, who were not in support of the nuclear deal with Iran. When that happened, the reformists who had that heavier influence in the Majlis lost seats, okay? And that's because they would have been involved in the process of approving that treaty. Okay, elections in Iran, and this is, we're going to talk about Iran's electoral system, okay? Iran's electoral system, we have direct elections, okay? Ballots do not have to identify a party or religious philosophy. They just have names. But again, people running for election have to be approved by the Guardian Council, okay? It is a single member district and multi-member district combo. The reason this is single member district is Majlis, okay, where each person has a constituency, just like a parliament, like in the UK. Multi-member district is the selection people for the Assembly of Religious Experts, because you only have 88 of them, so there's overlap. All right. There are also within the Majlis 28 multi-member districts where people where there's overlap. The place that this happens with the Majlis is going to be in heavily populated areas like Tehran. Okay. Two-round system, but the two-round system is used to kind of eliminate people who don't receive enough of the vote, enough of 25% on the first ballot, okay? Then the second round is for the top two candidates to determine a majority of support. Difference with Mexico, remember Mexico's plurality only, difference with the UK and Parliament, UK's plurality only, right? This is something that's a possible strong contrast or helpful as a contrast between Iran and the UK or Mexico. With the judiciary, okay, we have, again, Sharia law, so religious-based law, and also Qanun. Okay, Qanun is civil law, all right? This is code law in the sense that people in the United States or Western Europe would know laws that are then passed by the Majlis as well. There are no independent courts. Super important. No independent courts in the judiciary. We do not have an independent judicial branch, which I hope is very, very clear based on the details of that entire chart that I walked you through, okay? Especially when the Supreme Leader appoints the Chief Justice, and the Chief Justice appoints the Guardian Council, and the Guardian Council chooses people or approves of people who run for election in the Majlis. Religion, this is juris guardianship, pervades everything in Iran, so that means that we cannot have an independent judiciary. Penal code in terms of rule of law, we could look at this as, because it's retributive law that is very harsh. People who identify as LGBTQ, people who are accused of and found guilty of adultery, of drinking alcohol habitually. You have really stark enactions of punishment like the death penalty, including even death by stoning. The harshness of this has changed over time. There have been reforms, okay, when it comes to this really harsh interpretation of Shia Sharia law, in a movement toward imprisonment rather than public death, execution, or punishment. It is important to point out, folks, so that you know Iran does have the highest number of executions per year and the highest number of per capita executions in the world so the highest number of executions per year after China, rather, and the highest per capita per population in the world. So, religious law and even civil law is very much based on retribution, right? We could look at this as you possibly argue that this is rule by law, not rule of law, with the rule by law being the enforcement of religious interpretation of the Quran. Here I give you the breakdown. Okay, Sharia law with the religious aspects of it, and juris guardianship versus Qanun, okay, that is statutes passed by the Majlis, the people's law or code law, but it can never contradict Sharia and has to be vetted and approved by the Guardian Council and Supreme Leader. I'm actually going to pause, I think. Yeah, I'm going to pause and take a note that we got up to the Revolutionary Guard. Revolutionary Guard is important in that there are two different groups of military in Iran. The Revolutionary Guard is kind of in charge of internal security versus an external military force. Okay, but the thing that's significant here is the role that the military has in the economy with a series of trusts, right? So again, the importance of Iran being a rentier state. This also involves the influence of the Ayatollah, because the Ayatollah is the leader of the Revolutionary Guard who appoints active troops. All right, and here's the besiege. Okay, the paramilitary besiege does act as kind of this enforcement mechanism to suppress protests and investigate possible dissent. I'm actually going to pause here in terms of where we are with everything and the difference between the Revolutionary Guard and the Artash, or the actual military as a whole. But as I pause, and we got through, just as you know, as a side note, folks, we got through 56 of those slides. That's pretty good. Maybe I won't take many of these slides out. Maybe I'll keep what we've got. Benicio, Lynn, questions? How we doing with this overview of Iran? It's a lot of information, I know.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at the moment. I'll probably have like questions later on, but like at the moment it's just a lot of information. So I took a lot of notes. So
good, excellent.
Yeah.
And what I would, because I know that you mentioned that you hadn't read the section on Iran yet, right?
On Iran, no, I didn't read.
Yeah. So I think that what will help a lot is reading that section. I think it'll solidify a lot of what we just covered. I think the thing that the section on Iran doesn't really do really well is it tells you what all these different parts are of the theocratic side of the Iranian government and about juris guardianship, but doesn't really show you how it functions, which is why that chart and graph I hope is really, really helpful, because that dynamic is significant. It's something that could come up on a country-specific concept question, or honestly, being able to know the role of the Guardian Council in elections is like a really straightforward multiple choice question that comes up a lot. Lynn, did you have any questions?
Not at the moment. I think we're good right now.
Okay, and again, I know this is a lot, right? We just went like, woo, through a lot of information, 56 slides. Definitely read the section that you have on Iran. You might want to watch this again. Also, I know that there are probably like about 2 things that I went over that I misspoke when I was going through the slides. So, find my mistakes because they're there. They're not big ones, but they're very small ones. And we'll be reviewing this next week anyway, together in class. But for folks who do end up watching this, and I hope folks who weren't able to come to review and who are taking the exam do watch this, again, please read the section first and then watch this video. Otherwise, it is a lot. And Benicio, you and Lynn are superstars for having me be here with you and basically do info dump lecture semi-podcast all about Iran. I'm going to go ahead and pause or stop the recording here, but you are both awesome, and folks who are watching this here, you made it through to the end.